Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. My name is Anastasia Negruk, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for MyData-TRUST, also a Data Protection Officer for a number of clients. Today, we will speak about the life after clinical trial closure. But first, what we will try to do, we will start with some quiz. And for this, you will need probably, the easiest way to do it is to use your phone. So I'm starting the quiz now, just a few seconds to make sure that this is anonymous to start. So you see on the slide the QR code. You can scan the QR code with your phone. Alternatively, you can connect to kahoot.it. And it's important, .com, and I think you have the same in your chat in case it's easier for you to copy and paste. And you will need to introduce the game PIN if you are connecting directly on the web, which number you see here. So while waiting for people to connect, during this presentation, of course, you can ask questions. Don't hesitate to ask questions. You can ask them by putting them directly in the chat. I will address all your questions at the end of the presentation, but just to avoid, basically to avoid getting your question, I would really recommend you to ask your question as we go, even before the end of the session. So for now, we only have few people joining, so I'll wait a few seconds more. So we have 3 persons, 5 persons, and growing. So please don't hesitate to join the quiz. I think it's better to make it a little bit more interactive. I think it's funnier for everyone. So we have 6 people, maybe a little bit more. So yeah. So don't hesitate to connect either with your phone or with your browser, connecting the coordinates in the chat, kahoot.it, and in the chat you do have the number to connect. Good. So a few seconds more, waiting for people to join. Maybe 10 seconds, and then we will start. Okay, so let's start already. So first one, how are you feeling today? So you have some seconds to reply. So we will see. For those who just are waking up, if ever you're on the West Coast of US, I understand it's a little bit early for you. So if you're on the West Coast, thank you very much for joining us at such an early time. For those in the European time zone, I guess it's the end of the day. So I hope we are like towards the end of the week. It's very warm and even hot here in Europe. So I hope you're doing fine. So coming to the end of our timer, let's see how our audience is doing today. Okay, so most of people are ready to discover, which is great. So let's start discover. From your point of view, does GDPR and its siblings, what I mean by siblings, it's sister legislation, Switzerland, UK, Brazil, does GDPR apply after the end of the trial to the archived trial data? Let's see what our audience thinks about it. So you have several choices. Only until the lock of the database. No, the trial is over. It doesn't apply. If someone complains only, yes, it does apply. Or you also have the options, I don't know, or I am hesitant. And we already have a number of people who replied. So what it means, most say yes, and 1 person doesn't know, which is good. It means our audience is already pretty much aware, but we will see and maybe clarify things for the person who doesn't know yet. Our next question. what GDPR and its siblings apply to. So here our different options are the archiving itself and any access to it, or only when accessing the archived data, or only when retrieving data for new projects, or only when retrieving data for marketing authorization dossier. And again, options, I don't know, or I am hesitant. So a few more seconds before we know what the audience thinks. And the answer is being revealed now. So, well, most of people say archiving itself and any access to it. And one person, again, doesn't know yet. Our last question. My data, well, when I say my, it's not from the patient perspective, but my organization's data have been archived since 2005. Indeed, some companies existed well before GDPR implementation. Do I have to implement GDPR today? Let's see the answer on this question. So that's the question where you have been running clinical trials or other activities well before GDPR, but of course we are in front of archiving periods which are 25 years and even more sometimes. So data are still sitting somewhere within your organization. So does GDPR apply to this data? So let's see the answer. So the number of answers is growing and the time is counting out. So we are almost there. A few more seconds. Okay, so yes, if identifiable data, and some people are not sure, not only when retrieving data for a new project. Good. So it means that our audience is kind of shared between people who already have a good understanding of what's applicable and other people who are maybe wondering what's applicable more. So let's jump to our presentation. Indeed, trial closure is not the end of the processing. So the storage of data is a processing activity by itself. So when a clinical trial closes, the data does not leave the scope of data protection legislation, and storing it is an act of processing of data under GDPR, but also under other privacy laws. I already mentioned UK, Swiss, and Brazilian legislation, but many other legislations have copied or got inspired from GDPR, and they would have the same logic. As long as the data remains identifiable, even indirectly, even in pseudonymous form, every day it sits in the storage is a day of active and regulated processing. So why so? So what is really happening there that justify this approach that we are in front of the processing of personal data? So we can describe three types of situation. So when the trial ends, the data do not simply freeze. You freeze your database, but of course, there is an archiving data sitting somewhere. And basically, it can branch out in different situations. One is a pure archiving. Let's say that you're a young company, you run your first clinical trial, you finish this clinical trial, and maybe the rest of development is taking a little bit of time. So this is sitting in an archive, and it will be sitting there for at least 25 years, because this is the regulated timing of archiving of a clinical trial master file. And basically, during all this time, you will need at least to ensure the principles of CIA, meaning confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So this is our minimum elements, because when data are sitting somewhere where it's in paper, but it's never the case anymore, all our trimester files are electronic, the databases are electronic, so they can be hacked in, so the confidentiality can be broken, the integrity can be jeopardized. Little systems have a lifetime of 25 years plus. So it's not infrequent that the archiving starts in one system and needs to migrate to another. So in this case, integrity can be jeopardized. And availability. So depending on the way you're archiving your system, if it's a kind of live archiving, or if you, let's say, some years ago, you would probably archive on, I don't know, on a CD, on a USB key. So it's not sure it's something you can read after 25 years. So availability may be also an issue. So this is one scenario, pure archiving. Another scenario, you do have an archive, and you want to reuse this data. So you want to reuse this data because regulators ask you for something more, or maybe you have an idea of a new publication, or maybe you have even an idea of a new research, something new question to be answered using the same data. So this is another situation. And finally, there may be another reason yet to have access to your archive is the regulatory filing or even the licensing, where probably your partner or regulators will need to have access for this data. So archiving and the archives are not always this kind of locked environment. You may need to access to it for different reasons. And of course, and the data reuse and the processing of data for regulatory filing or in the scope of sharing with other stakeholders would be yet another processing activity. So what kind of things we can find in the, let's say, path B and C, so the reuse to start with. So this will contain new purposes beyond the trial itself. For instance, used to support a different trial. This is one. So you're running your next trial and you need to reanalyze certain bits and pieces of data from your previous trial to support your statistical consideration. You can also do a kind of portfolio level looking for safety signal and do some pooling across your compounds or across different trials for the same compound. You can do your own new research, or you can wish to share this data with academic community to do some additional research, so data sharing. That may also include the platforms, data sharing platforms. You can also nowadays think about AI model training on the log data set. So it's another question how to do it in GDPR compliant way, but this is one of the possible use of actually an archived data. You can wish to publish more or to disseminate more, and obviously there can be audits and inspections. So this is for the reuse of your archived data. And the path C is the regulatory filing. So licensing, out-licensing, due diligence kind of approaches, compilation for marketing authorization dossier, beyond what you maybe initially planned, even within what you initially planned. Again, looking on safety signals, cross-jurisdictional parallel filing, etc. And again, inspections, of course. So all types of uses of this archiving data, which are potentially going beyond the initial purpose, that depends on how you formulated the initial purpose, and which will result in additional processing activities that, of course, will need to be compliant. So let's look on archiving from another angle. So archiving is not the end of activities, it's just a new phase of risk. Indeed, during the clinical trial itself, when the data flow is usually very complex in clinical trials, and the data will flow from one stakeholder to another, the risk will be very elevated. While in the archiving, if done properly, risks are of course smaller, but we cannot say that risks are inexistent. So even if you have a properly handled archive and properly encrypted and everything, you cannot say that the risk of a data breach is zero. So it's a new phase of risk. In a global organization, the data are rarely combined in a single system, then or jurisdiction. So once the trial concludes, the trial master file, of course, will need to be combined. and kind of basically retrieved in one place, but sometimes it can be kept in several places. There is obviously need to be sure there is no data set which stays behind and can be used in an uncontrolled way. So whether through shadow IT or spare subsets that statisticians may be saved somewhere locally, or maybe your vendors that were involved in the active phase of the trial, they still keep your data. So maybe outside the vendor responsible for the archiving, that the vendors are closed appropriately, that they actually returned your data to you or destroyed it, depending on what's relevant. And archive data, of course, will need to stay accessible and reliable and secure for decades through maintenance, migration, and controlled access. And the clinical trial nowadays, under the European at least rules, after the end of the clinical trial, the data needs to be kept for 25 years. And obviously, if the trial gets on the market, this delay can even be eventually prolonged. So let's dive a little bit more into archiving. So if we are in this situation where the only thing we do is archiving, we are not doing data reuse, we are not doing licenses, marketing authorization, like this looks very passive. What's there? Well, first, maintenance. We are maintaining data in systems, which are living systems. It needs patching, monitoring, and basically upkeeping of the infrastructure. As I'm saying, long time period, so it's very likely at least once or maybe even twice, you will have to migrate from one system to another. And migration also requires specific safeguards to ensure that data are not modified, disappeared. Any decent archiving system will have a backup. So this is also a processing activity. And maybe eventual mirroring. It's true that mirroring is basically typical for business continuity plans. Usually is used for active databases. It's less frequent that archives are mirrored. But again, depending on the time, like depending on the way you configured your archives, that can be different. And of course, the last part that can be done with your archives is the controlled access for regulatory use or approved scientific research. So when the archiving goes wrong, what can happen? So we do know that a lot of criticisms say that basically there is not enough scrutiny, and I think all managers, CEO or top management of companies, they're used to play with the risk. So basically, what can go wrong with archiving? And basically, do we even have the case law where authorities even looked on the archiving? Well, we do. We kind of picked 5 enforcement cases that we would like to present to you to demonstrate how how things can go wrong. So first case, not specific to the life science. So it was a fine delivered to an insurer, so not our sector. And the fine, it's pretty old case, 2020, impressive fine. And basically the retention rules were written on paper, but not in systems. And so basically it resulted in the fact that a lot of data were retained beyond limits, in some cases even 30 years. The retention framework existed, so they had a very nice procedure or something describing for how long they're keeping which data. But actually that was not happening in practice. So data were not de facto deleted. And on top, there was no real separation between archived data and active data. And so historical records stayed as accessible as the others. If we transpose it to see how that can be mirrored in the life science sector, well, the trial master file gets archived, and usually those are real archives, as kept separate from the active data. But the clinical trial database may stay in the normal environment with no additional technical and organizational measures, maybe under the limited access, because number of RDC platforms actually have no genuine archiving solution. So basically the archive is just the fact to limit the access from multiple people to maybe just 2 or 3 persons. So this is really this example from the life science that we frequently see in the sector would be an exact mirror of the case where CNIL issued 1.75 million fine. Another case still outside of our sector, so archiving without a delete button. So here we are in front of archiving system with no deletion capacity whatsoever. So basically, this storage solution didn't allow to delete the data, and it kept the trace of the data behind. And so this cannot be a viable solution to hope to comply with the regulation. And here is the case where the fine is even more. What we do see is many EDC, RDC platforms, basically they do not enable really a deletion, because of course clinical trial environment is built with audit trails and this idea that data shall not be corrupted, deleted, modified. But sometimes it goes as far as actually the data cannot ever be truly erased. And so that kind of is problematic. So that again calls to the appropriate assessment of the archiving vendor, but can be a problem. Third case, still not specific to the life science. So inherited legacy, inherited risk. Basically, in this case, the hotel had access to the archive of the company they acquired, and it's historic data. So basically, it was in a different security environment. And here, basically, there were an attack and it stayed undetected. And basically, because it was a legacy and no one really paid attention. And so that came out also within a press line. So how we can replicate it to our environment? Well, what we see frequently when a biotech winds down or get acquired, it basically keeps the data and can bring it to their new adventure. So they do have the legacy data sets that sometimes companies don't even remember are sitting somewhere. And so this case can be reproduced in our environment. So if you are sitting or having data that you acquired from another biotech, or if you have been an owner of a biotech which stopped and you just kept this data and took it in the environment of your new adventure, well, it's sitting there. Even if this data was gathered decades before, it's still under the scope. Now we are coming more to the life science or health examples. So here it's an example from Daedalus Biology, immigration with no procedure behind it. So there was no defined procedure existed for migration of data in a new system. Data left unencrypted with no automated deletion after migration, which was planned for the data before. And on top of this, there were shared user accounts used across employees. And basically the lesson here is that over 25 years, you will be in the need to migrate your archives, and it needs to be done properly with appropriate procedure and validation that your migration went well. Another life science or healthcare case, here the organization was reusing large-scale patient data sets in health data warehouse for years. So some people believe that from the moment they collect the data and the data have been collected in the legitimate way and everything was done, then afterwards, this database, you can work it out. Actually, the unit, the Lego that constructs privacy is not data, is not a database, it's not a data warehouse. it's the use. So even if your data warehouse was built in a legitimate way, respecting all rules and obligations, each time you are using this data for a purpose, this is the unit of compliance. That's where you will need to think about, oh, what is my legal basis? Did I inform the data subject? Maybe I already did, but you will need to do this check. What vendors do I use? What are my contracts, etc.? Do I need to do a DPIA? So it's per use. And so if you have a data warehouse and you just freely exploit it how you want, this setting would not be compliant even if your data warehouse as such is compliant. And again, 800K fine issued in 2024. So what obligations persist beyond the end of the trial? Just look on the pure archiving just to simplify. Principles. Transparency, not really in that sense that you are archiving something, the archiving is the continuation of your initial activity. And so normally you already explained to data subjects that their data will be archived for 25 years. So from this perspective, transparency doesn't apply in the sense that you do not re-inform people. The purpose limitation still applies. As I was saying, if you are trying to use the archive data for something, you will need to check, is it in the scope of your initial purpose? Maybe it's just a delayed activity, or is it a new purpose? So the purpose limitations still apply. Data minimization still apply. If you defined your retention period as 25 years, you really need to delete this data after 25 years. The storage limitation, so this is the same. And so after these 25 years, you would need just to basically delete or anonymize your data. And of course, integrity and confidentiality persist. In terms of the data minimization, so we generally say that clinical trial data are kept for 25 years, but actually within the data set, there are different subsets of data. Not all of them need to be kept for 25 years. So for instance, sometimes samples are kept for shorter periods. And so some of the data which are tightly related to samples, so this needs to be taken into account. In terms of the rights, so data subject rights persist as well. Access and portability, they persist in principle. Of course, they're conditional. They're related to the legal basis, but they persist. Rectification rate, it's limited, but we cannot say that it's completely unexisting. Restriction and objection persist in principle, conditional as well. And again, the right to information, well, at least the obligation to inform, normally is not re-triggered because we suppose that we already informed data subject. In terms of obligation, the record needs to be kept. It might be that you need to conduct a new DPIA. DPIA needs to be revisited. It's a living document. So initially, in the beginning of the trial, you describe what's done in a trial. You don't speak yet about the archiving. You will not focus on whether your encryption during the archiving is correct, whether your access rules are correct. So maybe revisit your DPIA when you go into archiving period, or if all of your trial go in a central archiving system, it might be a more efficient way to do an archiving DPIA covering all of your projects. So transfers still stay relevant. Your archiving system can be abroad. Contractors, so your archiving vendor, need to be assessed. So you will need to do contract diligence. And of course, because the archived data are basically cumulated data, it's the same amount of data that during your clinical trial, but over time you will pile up. So you are actually archiving even a large amount of data because it's not probably only one clinical trial, it will be more. And so the obligations of DPO and DPR, if they existed during the lifespan of a clinical trial, they still exist during the archiving period. What to focus on? Try to avoid fragmentation. So try to, let's say your database is in one place and your trial master file is in another place. Do not let all your trial vendors sit on archives, because this is much, much harder to control. And consider possibly different retention periods per data subset. Vendors do not inherit data nor accountability. So this is very important. So you outsource storage, you don't outsource accountability, at least definitely not under GDPR. And you need to properly close vendors that you are not relying on for archiving specifically. Implement, do not just write. So writing, we are storing clinical trials data for 25 years, that's not enough. What is interesting to know is whose responsibility is it to monitor, to wake up, to say, guys, now we are at 25 years, we need to delete. Whose responsibility is it to delete the data? So what we see, of course, clinical data is one of the major assets in our sector. It can be frightening to push on the button delete if such button exists. So also pay attention if this type of decision need to be escalated, on which level, but without it, actually it will never happen. So you will have a document that says 25 years, but when this time pass, no one would take the risk to delete this data unless you clearly allocate this responsibility. What to focus on else? DPIA, living document, or make just an archiving focused DPIA. Obviously, if you are a data controller, if you are a data processor, if you are this archiving vendor, it's not your obligation to write the DPIA, but it may be interesting for you to do because probably your clients will see it as an added value. So access needs to stay tightly controlled. So you really need the gatekeeper, someone who would really check that no one has access to the data and who will ask appropriate questions when people access the data. And the oversight, the DPO DPR, extends into archiving. So long-term storage, you can see risks, but you also can see rewards. So if archiving fails, what risks are there? Regulatory fines, obviously. Delays in submission and inspections. Do you imagine if inspector comes, ask you to provide them subset of data that were archived and you're unable to retrieve them? That can be a major trouble for the company. I would say probably even worse than the fines from the Data Protection Authority. That will result in reputational damage, obviously, also to the partnership. You can lose acquisition opportunities because the asset are data. You can obviously have data breaches and malicious activities, and overall you can have operational disruption from data loss. If archiving is well thought and is strategic and compliant, you will have smoother global regulatory interactions. You will have a maximized or enabled secondary use of data for innovation while being fully compliant. You will have a proactive data quality assurance over time. You will gain trust with investors, partners, authorities. You will have faster, cleaner, and better quality due diligence processes. And actually, you will demonstrate resilience against long horizon threats. So the governance must outlast the trial. So oversight cannot end when the trial ends. DPO oversight extends. Incident readiness stays live, and data subject rights persist. From liability to advantage, how to go there? Clinical trial data is a long-term asset. It needs to be managed well. It's also long-term liability because it can get turned against you. And the difference is governance over time. One-off compliance effort at closure is not enough. So definitely the frequency of monitoring of oversight actions will not be as frequent as during the trial because the risk decrease, but it still needs to be planned and needs to be regular. Key takeaways: storage is a processing activity 25 years is a long time, and the governance must outlast the trial. And the bottom line, clinical trial data does not leave the scope of privacy compliance when the study ends. So this is the end of our presentation. So I hope we did receive some questions in the chat. So I'll just go and check what we can have there. I don't know if we got any questions in the chat. Still waiting for my colleagues to nicely point me to any questions. Okay. So one question here, can you list the recommended measures or actions to ensure that retention periods are properly implemented and are not solely in paper form? So yes, what you do need, so normally your retention periods are defined in your records of processing activities. Some people also put them in the privacy policy or retention and destruction policy. This is good, but this is only the start. So what you need a procedure. So you need to allocate the responsibility. One way to do is, for instance, to say that you do have, and obviously you don't need to look on it as an additional person, it's just a function you can put on top of someone's else responsibility. One way to do is to call it the archivist. So you would have an archivist, a person who will have the oversight of all your archives. And so this person responsibility, one of them will be, for instance, to monitor the timelines. So let's say in the beginning of each year, they would verify that the retention periods are still okay. And if we are approaching the end of retention period, they will be able to start internally an appropriate discussion to eventually arrive to the conclusion that the data needs to be deleted. Another way of doing, less centralized, is that you specify what function is responsible to monitor the trial master file and the trial database, so everything which is around the parts of clinical trial which are archived. And again, you put a cycle on it. You can also plan for, let's say, a review at the organizational level in whatever committee that, for instance, every 5 years, the list of clinical trials and all data stored will be reviewed. And so you're kind of planning for the next time and you are confirming when the data will need to be deleted. So this is the type of the procedure that you need to put in place in order to be sure that the delays are respected. So I'm not sure if we have any more questions. Just looking on my chat. So I think there is one question coming in. Just a few seconds more. So the other role of this archivist, which can be very handy, is that can be gatekeeper. So if you have a request to access for archive, this person can actually be the starting point and then sort out between activities which are still within the primary purpose. Let's say the regulators asked an additional question, but then they can also distinguish between, let's say, we have a partner that asked us to share data with them. This is the secondary use. And so gatekeeper, meaning saying immediately, yes, okay, green light, or putting the request through a different channel for the secondary use of data. So we have another question, how to manage a decision on access to annulled archives of data that have been archived before GDPR. So data that have been archived before GDPR. GDPR is not truly retrospective. So whatever happened to this data before GDPR implementation, before 2018, that stays behind. But whatever happened after needs to comply, meaning your archive needs to comply with GDPR. And also it means that if you provide access to this archive today, whatever you do needs to comply to GDPR. How to manage the access? Well, one of the ways to manage the access is to have this gatekeeper. This is first. And more kind of centralized it is, simpler it is to manage, though decentralized models can be put in place as well. And your gatekeeper, basically, you would list the possible users. You would already decide and describe what are the users which are kind of can be released directly. For instance, regulators asked an additional question. So for this, your archivist will be able to give access to archives directly. And otherwise, let's say it's an additional research, there we would recommend to put in place a procedure for the secondary use of data, to have a little committee where usually you will involve the data protection officer, your legals, because there might be constraints from the contractual side, also to check the legislation which may have changed, and maybe some kind of scientific oversight, which you will probably be interested to include anyway. And so this governance committee will kind of review cases case by case and decide what's done with it. And then before you actually release the data, whatever obligations apply, depending on the uses, you will be able to comply with this obligation, whether you need to sign a data sharing agreement, where you need to do a DPIA or whatever. And so you release the data when the obligations are complied with. So this is a different process and one fits in the other. Another question we have, can you elaborate more on how sponsors with global clinical trials approach data retention of each country, which may have different requirements? So very nice question. Indeed, different jurisdictions have different rules and different kind of the time the archiving needs to be kept. What needs to be known as is usually the inspectors, and I'm not speaking about data protection audits. I'm speaking about GCP inspectors and like FDA inspectors, EMA inspectors. So these inspectors look on data from the drug perspective and from the trial perspective, depending on why the inspection is for. So they actually do not really care, giving an example of a safety event. They wouldn't care if a bad toxicity occurred in Europe or in US or in Latin America or wherever. For them, what counts is to be able to inspect the full data to make sure that it's kind of correct, authentic, that analysis is not biased, etc. So basically, if you do have different retention periods in different jurisdictions of one and same clinical trial, or of one and same, I would say, registered drug warehouse, you need to align on the biggest retention period. So let's say that Europe says 25 years and another territory say 15, your whole clinical trial will be aligned on 25. So if a business puts all its data and paper documents in a vault and leaves it, does that measure provide sufficient protection and good governance? No, because so again, a data vault, probably there is a vendor behind. You probably assessed the vendor. They probably put certain measures in place. So we hope that they do backups. We hope that they make sure that data is still confidential, integer, and available. But if you are in the position of a data controller, you cannot just leave the data somewhere. You need to still care about it. Here, paper documents, it's the same. So even if you store paper documents in a secure location, which is hopefully protected against flood, fire, mouses, whatever pests, you are still a data controller. You still need to kind of check in time to time and to make sure that your vendor actually did what they're supposed to do. So this is the same as a vendor outside. So we are in clinical trials environment a lot. ICA-GCP applies. So you will not delegate something to a vendor and to keep the delegated activity unattended for 25 years. So just looking on my watch, I don't know if we have eventually any other questions. Maybe waiting just 3 seconds for the audience to react or for the questions to come to me. So otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope it was instructive for you and that you learned something more. And I hope this for the audience who attended, but probably also people who will definitely look on this presentation, not necessarily live, but in a deferred way. So just checking if any, yeah, so we don't have any more questions. So thank you very much for your attendance. Before we close, I would like to tell you that if you did like this interaction, if you want to know more about different topics in the area, in September, we do have a summit in Boston. So you are very welcome. And also for people who are maybe not in US, but in the European Union, we will also have a summit in Brussels in January. And any eventual additional question that maybe you dropped in the chat that were not answered, we will answer that in the follow-up. So you will all get your answers. Thank you.